That morning, my son-in-law slapped me across the face, and I chose to stay completely quiet. By dinner, I cooked a grand feast for the family. My daughter smiled and said, "Finally, Dad understands." That was until she saw who was sitting at the head of the table. I am Harrison Caldwell, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my own family inflicted on me. As a structural engineer and real estate developer, I spent my life building a fortress of security for my loved ones, only to realize I had constructed my own prison. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. The bitter winter chill of Chicago seemed to slice through the heavy glass windows of the library, but that cold was nothing compared to the freezing reality waiting for me inside. This was my house. I designed every inch of this $4 million mansion in Oak Brook. I calculated the load-bearing walls, laid the foundation, and poured my life savings into it as a wedding gift for my daughter Valerie and her husband Preston. I wanted them to have the perfect start. But as I pushed open the oak doors to the library, expecting to quietly grab a book and enjoy my morning coffee, the peaceful silence of the house was violently shattered. The harsh grinding noise of the heavy paper shredder echoed through the room. Preston was standing there, his back turned to me. He was wearing his expensive tailored suit, the one he usually wore to his high-level investment banking job. His posture was wrong. He was hunched over his shoulders, tense, his hands moving with a frantic energy. He was shoving a thick stack of papers into the machine. I stood frozen in the doorway for a fraction of a second. My mind, trained for 40 years to instantly recognize structural anomalies and hidden flaws, immediately registered that something was terribly wrong. Preston was always meticulously composed. He was a man who obsessed over his perfectly styled hair and luxury watches. Seeing him sweating, his hands shaking as he fed the documents into the steel blades, triggered a massive alarm in my head. I took a slow, silent step forward on the thick Persian rug. Preston was so consumed by his panicked task that he did not hear me approach. The shredder jammed for a moment, whining under the volume of the thick paper. Preston cursed under his breath, yanking at the stack. In his reckless haste, a single page slipped from his trembling fingers. It fluttered through the air, catching the morning light, and landed softly on the hardwood floor, drifting inches away from my leather slippers. I calmly leaned down and picked it up. The paper was heavy, expensive. My eyes locked onto the embossed logo at the very top. It was the official crest of a prominent offshore bank located in the Cayman Islands. Below the crest, I saw a string of complex routing numbers and a massive sum of money listed under an account name I did not recognize. "What are you doing, Preston?" I asked. My voice was low, steady, and dangerously calm. Preston spun around, as if he had just been struck by lightning. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. His eyes darted wildly from my face to the paper held firmly in my hand. For a split second, I saw absolute terror in his eyes. He looked like a trapped animal. But then, right before my eyes, that terror rapidly twisted into something else. It morphed into a dark, explosive rage. "Give me that," he hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying aggression. Before I could process the account numbers, before I could ask another question, Preston lunged at me. He did not just snatch the paper. He threw his body weight forward, ripping the document from my grip with his left hand, while his right hand swung through the air in a brutal arc. The back of his hand collided squarely with my jaw. The sheer force of the impact snapped my head back violently. For 40 years, I evaluated the stress loads of commercial skyscrapers. I understood physics. I knew exactly how much force was required to compromise a solid structure. The force of Preston's swing was not a warning. It was meant to destroy. My vision flashed with a blinding white light. My feet tangled in the rug, and my 70-year-old body was launched backward. I crashed heavily into the solid edge of the mahogany desk. The sharp corner of the wood dug brutally into my lower spine, sending a shockwave of pure agony up my back. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, the world spinning around me. A hot metallic taste flooded my mouth. I raised a trembling hand to my lips and saw the bright red smear of my blood. I sat there on the cold, hardwood floor, staring up at the man I had welcomed into my home, the man I had entrusted with my daughter's future. Preston stood towering over me. His chest was heaving heavily. His fists were clenched tight at his sides. He did not look sorry. He did not look regretful. He looked down at me with an expression of pure contempt, as if I were nothing more than a pathetic insect. He had just assaulted me in my own home. He had violently struck the man who bought the very roof over his head. Every single instinct in my body, every ounce of pride I possessed, screamed at me to fight back. I wanted to stand up, grab him by the collar of his expensive shirt, and throw him out into the freezing street. I wanted to destroy him right then. I tasted the copper blood pooling in my mouth, and my muscles coiled, ready to react. But my analytical mind, the calculating engineer inside me, slammed the brakes. If I reacted with blind anger now, I would lose the advantage. I had seen the Cayman Islands logo. I had seen his desperate panic. Preston was hiding a catastrophic secret, a structural failure so deep that it threatened to bring this entire family crashing down. A physical fight would solve nothing. It would only give him the opportunity to cover his tracks and manipulate the narrative. I needed to understand the full scope of the rot before I swung the wrecking ball. Preston took a step closer to me, looking down at my bleeding face. He opened his mouth, his lips curling into a cruel sneer, ready to unleash his poison. I braced myself on the floor, my mind racing furiously, calculating my next move, weighing every variable. But before a single word could leave his mouth, the heavy brass handle of the library door clicked loudly. We both froze. The massive door swung wide open, revealing the bright hallway behind it. Valerie stood framed in the heavy oak doorway. She was wearing a silk morning robe, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to sudden, absolute horror. I fully expected Preston to freeze in his tracks. I expected him to stumble over his words or make a frantic run for the exit. But I vastly underestimated the sheer sociopathic agility of the man my daughter had married. In the blink of an eye, the violent predator standing over me vanished entirely. Preston dropped to his knees with a loud thud, his hands flying out to grip my shoulders. His grip was bruising his fingers, digging ruthlessly into my collarbone, but his face was a masterpiece of terrified concern. "Valerie, thank God you are here," Preston cried out. His voice was completely transformed, laced with a perfect imitation of panic and relief. "He is hallucinating again." I walked in and he was completely disoriented. He tried to grab a heavy paperweight to smash the glass window. I had to step in and restrain him before he hurt himself, but he fought me. He slipped on the rug and hit the desk. I stared at him, blood dripping from my chin onto my collared shirt. My mind processed the lie with the cold precision of a structural stress test. It was flawless. It played perfectly into the narrative he had been carefully constructing for the past 6 months. The misplaced keys, the canceled appointments, the subtle suggestions that my memory was failing. He had been laying the groundwork for this exact moment. He had been preparing to erase me. Valerie gasped and rushed across the room. She dropped to her knees beside us, her robe pooling on the Persian rug. She did not look at Preston with suspicion. She looked at me with a devastating, suffocating pity. It was a look that cut deeper than the physical blow I had just taken. She reached out with a trembling hand and gently stroked my bleeding face. Her fingers brushed against the swelling bruise on my jaw. "Oh, Dad," Valerie whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Dad, look at you. Look what you did to yourself." I opened my mouth to speak. I wanted to scream the truth. I wanted to tell her to look at the shredder, to look at the Cayman Islands document I had dropped on the floor when I fell. I wanted to tell her that the man holding my shoulders was a violent fraud. But as I drew breath, Preston's fingers dug ruthlessly into my collarbone, a silent, agonizing warning. Then Valerie spoke the words that stopped my heart completely. "The doctor warned us the dementia would escalate," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. He warned us there might be aggressive episodes. I did not want to believe it, but we cannot ignore this anymore. I am signing the transfer papers for the Sunnyside Care Facility on Monday, Dad. It is for your own safety. We cannot risk you hurting yourself again. Sunnyside. It was a high-security lockdown facility for patients with severe cognitive decline, a place where you were heavily medicated and stripped of all legal autonomy. Once I was inside those walls, Preston would have unhindered access to my estate. He would have total power of attorney. He could liquidate everything I had spent a lifetime building. He was not just trying to cover up a bad investment. He was executing a hostile takeover of my entire existence. The urge to fight back was overwhelming. The adrenaline surged through my veins, urging me to push them both away, to stand tall and declare my sanity. But then my gaze drifted past Valerie's weeping face. I looked out into the bright hallway. There, hiding just behind the heavy doorframe, I saw them. A pair of small, glowing sneakers. They were trembling. My 7-year-old grandson Leo was standing there silently watching the nightmare unfold. He was clutching his favorite stuffed bear, his little knuckles white with fear. He had seen enough to be terrified, but he was too young to understand the danger. If I fought back now, if I turned this into a violent confrontation, Preston would escalate. The man who was willing to strike a 70-year-old in the face to hide a piece of paper would not hesitate to do worse. If I called the police right now, it would be my word against theirs. Preston had built my medical record. He had Valerie on his side. The police would see a confused, bleeding old man resisting his loving family. And worse, Leo would be caught in the crossfire. He would be left in the custody of a desperate, violent man. I could not afford to act on emotion. I had to build a case that could not be dismantled. I had to gather evidence so overwhelming that neither Preston's lies nor Valerie's blind devotion could save him. So I made the hardest choice of my life. I swallowed my pride along with the blood in my mouth. I let my shoulders slump. I let the fire die out of my eyes, replacing it with a vacant, cloudy stare. I let my jaw hang slightly slack. I became exactly what Preston needed me to be. A broken, confused old man. I am sorry. I mumbled, my voice weak and trembling. I do not know what happened. I just wanted to read a book. Valerie let out a quiet sob and hugged me carefully. It is okay, Dad. We have you. We are going to get you the help you need. Preston slowly released his bruising grip on my shoulders. He stood up, towering over us, smoothing out his suit jacket. I could see the triumphant smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully neutralized the only threat to his operation. Let us get him back to the guest house, Val, Preston said, his voice dripping with fake compassion. He needs to rest. I will clean up this mess. I knew exactly what mess he intended to clean up. The shredder, the offshore bank documents, the evidence of his financial ruin. Valerie helped me to my feet. I leaned heavily on her arm, dragging my feet across the floor. I let my body mimic the frailty of advanced age. Every step sent a jolt of pain through my bruised back, but I focused entirely on maintaining the illusion. We walked slowly out of the library, past the shredder, past the man who had assaulted me. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor. As we passed the doorframe, little Leo peeked out. His eyes were wide and frightened. I wanted to scoop him up and carry him far away from this house. Instead, I gave him a slow, confused smile, the kind a stranger gives to a child. I had to protect him by pretending I could not protect myself. Valerie guided me across the cold courtyard toward the guest house. The heavy oak door clicked shut. My trembling stopped immediately. My eyes hardened. I pulled out my phone. The 8-hour countdown begins. It was exactly 8:30 in the morning when I locked the deadbolt of the guest house. The moment the brass lock clicked into place, the hunched posture I had maintained across the courtyard vanished. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back until the joints popped. I went to the bathroom sink. I splashed freezing water over my face to wash away the blood on my chin. I grabbed a white towel and wiped my face clean. Staring at my reflection in the mirror, I saw the dark purple bruise blooming along my jawline. I did not look like a dementia patient. I looked like a man preparing for war. Preston thought he was dealing with a frail old man whose mind was slipping into the fog of age. When I constructed the main mansion, I did not just pour the concrete and frame the load-bearing walls. I designed the entire digital infrastructure. I personally ran miles of fiber optic cable through the drywall. I set up the central router in the basement utility room, establishing a secure sub-network that Preston did not even know existed. He was a finance guy who thought buying an expensive router meant he owned the network. But a network is just like a building. If you pour the foundation, you hold the master keys to every room inside. I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. I bypassed the standard wireless network that Valerie and Preston used for their phones and televisions. Instead, I accessed the administrative backdoor I had hardwired into the system 5 years ago. A black command terminal popped up on my screen. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a steady, practiced rhythm. I was not panicking. I was operating with the cold, detached precision of a structural engineer examining a bridge that was on the verge of total collapse. You trace the stress fractures down to the foundation to see exactly where the rot started. Preston was arrogant. Arrogant men always believe they are the smartest people in the room, which makes them sloppy. He had set up a personal cloud server on the home network to synchronize his phone and his laptop. He used a basic encryption protocol, probably thinking a string of complex passwords would keep anyone out. But I was not trying to guess his passwords. I was simply rerouting his data packets through the administrative gateway I already controlled. Within 10 minutes, I was inside his primary directory. I ignored his standard folders. I went straight for the hidden directories, focusing specifically on the deleted files. When people panic, they try to erase their tracks. I found his cloud trash bin. It was overflowing with documents he had hurriedly deleted over the past few weeks, likely trying to scrub his digital footprint before sending me away to the care facility. I began restoring the files one by one, organizing them by date. The first document I opened was a scanned PDF. The letterhead belonged to the prestigious investment bank in downtown Chicago, where Preston claimed to be a senior vice president. My eyes scanned the crisp text. It was a termination notice. I checked the date at the top of the page. It was signed and dated 4 months ago. Preston had not been going to work. He had been fired. I read further down the page to find the reason for his dismissal. He was terminated for gross misconduct, unauthorized trading, and severe violations of corporate compliance. For 4 entire months, he had been putting on his tailored suits every morning, kissing Valerie goodbye, and driving off in his luxury car, pretending to go to a job that no longer existed. Speaking of the cars, I opened the next restored file. It was a collection of urgent notices from a high-end auto financing company. Preston and Valerie drove matching silver Porsches. Preston always bragged about paying cash for them, claiming it was a perk of his massive annual bonuses. The notices on my screen painted a very different picture. Both vehicles were leased. Furthermore, the accounts were marked as deeply delinquent. He was 3 months behind on the payments for both cars. The financing company was threatening immediate repossession. The aggressive red text on the final notice stated that tow trucks had already been authorized to collect the vehicles. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy life was shattering before my eyes. The man who had just slapped me for finding a piece of paper was completely broke. But being broke did not explain the sheer, unadulterated terror I had seen in his eyes in the library. Being broke did not explain why a man would risk assaulting his father-in-law. Debt to a bank is a civil matter. It brings shame, but it does not bring that kind of primal fear. I needed to find the source of his panic. I scrolled further down the list of recovered files. There was a compressed folder buried deep inside a system directory. It was heavily encrypted, far more secure than anything else on the server. He had named it with a single unassuming word: liabilities. I sat back in my chair, staring at that word. Liabilities. In engineering, A liability is a variable that can compromise the safety of a structure. In finance, it is a debt. But in the context of his frantic behavior, I knew it meant something far worse. I initiated a brute force decryption program I had used during my corporate contracting days. The software began running algorithms hammering against the security wall. I watched the progress bar inch forward. 10%, 20%. I listened to the quiet hum of my laptop fan, feeling a heavy knot forming in my stomach. The things I was uncovering were tearing apart the reality my daughter lived in. Valerie believed she was married to a successful, loving provider. She had no idea she was sleeping next to a desperate liar. 50%. 70%. I thought about little Leo. I thought about how he had hidden behind the door watching his father strike me. I had to protect that boy. I had to rip this poison out of our family by the roots. 90%. The progress bar flashed green. Access granted. The folder unlocked, spilling its contents onto my screen. There were dozens of text files, scanned images of handwritten ledgers, and a single massive master spreadsheet. I double-clicked the spreadsheet, holding my breath. The document opened, filling my monitor with hundreds of rows of data. It was a comprehensive tracking log of incoming and outgoing funds. The money was not moving through traditional banks. It was bouncing through offshore holding companies, cryptocurrency exchanges, and wire transfers to shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. I scrolled down my eyes, tracking the running total column. The numbers grew rapidly. 50,000, 200,000, 1 million. I scrolled faster, the wheel of my mouse clicking softly in the quiet room. I finally reached the very bottom of the spreadsheet. I looked at the final tally, highlighted in bold red text. The blood drained from my face. $3,140,000. The number sat at the bottom of the spreadsheet in a bold, bloody red font. I stared at the bright screen, my breath turning shallow, as the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic failure settled into my mind. It was exactly 9:30 in the morning, and the quiet comfort of my guest house felt completely suffocating. I leaned closer to the monitor, tracing the columns of data upward to understand the anatomy of this disaster. The ledger was a chaotic timeline of sheer desperation. Preston had not been making terrible investments in the stock market. He had been funneling massive, escalating wire transfers into a network of offshore accounts that traced back to a notorious underground sports betting syndicate. He had been gambling. The man my daughter married, the polished executive who drank imported wine and wore tailored suits, was a degenerate gambler who had leveraged his entire life on phantom victories. I began cross-referencing the outgoing payment dates with the routing numbers of Valerie's personal accounts. I built those trust funds decades ago. I poured every drop of sweat every long night on active construction sites into creating an impenetrable financial wall to protect my daughter. As I traced the digital footprints, I watched Preston tear that wall down brick by brick. Over the past 4 months, perfectly corresponding with the date he was terminated from the investment bank, Preston had systematically liquidated Valerie's trust funds. He forged authorizations, bypassed secondary security protocols, and drained the accounts completely dry to feed his escalating addiction. But the most horrifying part of the spreadsheet was the remaining balance. Despite stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from his own wife, the red number at the bottom proved it was not nearly enough. He was still drowning in a $3 million deficit. The ruthless syndicate was still demanding their money, and Preston had run out of liquid assets to steal. My analytical mind began to race, clicking the puzzle pieces into place with a terrifying clarity. The sudden urgency to declare me mentally incompetent, the exaggerated performance in the library this morning, the aggressive push to transfer me to the Sunnyside Care Facility on Monday. It was never about my health. It was never about protecting me from imaginary hallucinations. If Valerie signed those medical transfer papers, and I was legally committed to a high-security cognitive care ward, I would be stripped of all my legal autonomy. As Valerie's husband Preston would undoubtedly maneuver to secure total power of attorney over my entire estate. He was not just trying to hide his unemployment from his family. He was orchestrating a hostile financial takeover. He needed my extensive investment portfolios. He needed the massive equity in this $4 million mansion. He was going to sell my life's work to pay off his violent bookies, leaving my daughter and my young grandson completely destitute in the process. A cold, heavy dread washed over my entire body. I had dealt with ruthless corporate developers and aggressive commercial contractors throughout my long career. But an underground gambling syndicate operated on an entirely different set of rules. They did not file civil lawsuits in a courtroom when you owed them $3 million. They did not send polite collection agencies to your door. They collected their massive debts through targeted fear, psychological intimidation, and brutal physical violence. If Preston had completely exhausted his available funds, the syndicate would inevitably start applying intense physical pressure to his family. My pulse quickened as a sickening, terrifying thought crept into my mind. I quickly minimized the financial spreadsheet and opened a new, secure terminal window. I accessed the primary security mainframe for the entire estate. When I personally oversaw the construction of this property, I installed a comprehensive grid of high-definition exterior cameras covering every single angle of the perimeter, the main driveway, and the public street leading up to our heavy iron gates. Preston foolishly thought these expensive cameras were just a visual deterrent for common local burglars. I knew they were an unblinking historical record of everything that moved. I began scrubbing through the encrypted archived video feeds from the past 72 hours. I watched the fast-forwarded footage of delivery trucks dropping off mundane packages, the local landscaping crew trimming the front hedges, and Valerie casually driving away to her morning fitness classes. Everything appeared entirely normal on the smooth surface. But I was not looking for comforting normalcy. I was actively searching for structural anomalies. I switched my main view to the high-resolution camera mounted on the heavy stone pillar near the main public road. I slowed the video playback speed to normal time, paying close attention to the unknown vehicles parked along the quiet suburban shoulder. Monday morning showed absolutely nothing unusual. Tuesday afternoon simply showed an older neighbor walking a golden retriever down the sidewalk. I pushed the digital timeline forward, dragging the slider to yesterday afternoon. The video timestamp displayed exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the exact time my grandson finished his school day. I switched the feed from my estate to a secondary cloud-linked camera I had discreetly installed on the dashboard of Valerie's SUV for her safety years ago. The camera recorded the busy street directly outside of little Leo's elementary school. Children were pouring out of the main brick building, laughing and running toward their waiting parents. Valerie's vehicle was parked in the designated pickup zone, waiting patiently for Leo to emerge from the heavy glass doors. I watched the background of the video feed scanning the perimeter of the schoolyard. The hair on the back of my neck suddenly stood straight up. My blood ran completely cold as my eyes locked onto a disturbing detail in the upper left corner of the screen. I paused the video playback and zoomed in on the specific frame. I enhanced the digital resolution, sharpening the blurred pixels until the image became crystal clear. Parked illegally in a shadowed loading zone directly across the street from the elementary school was a sleek, unmarked black sedan with heavily tinted windows. The driver's side window was rolled down just a few crucial inches. Through that narrow, dark gap, I could clearly see the grim faces of 2 broad-shouldered men wearing cheap, badly tailored gray suits. They were not looking at the school building. They were not looking at the busy traffic. One of the men was holding a pair of professional-grade black binoculars pressed tightly to his face. I followed the direct line of sight from the lenses of the binoculars across the busy street. They were staring directly at little Leo as he happily skipped down the concrete stairs and climbed into the back seat of Valerie's waiting car. They were watching my grandson. The terrible reality of the situation crushed down upon me with an immense, suffocating weight. Preston had completely run out of time, and now the violent syndicate was aggressively stalking the only innocent child left in our shattered family, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My blood turned to absolute ice. My blood turned to absolute ice. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs with a heavy, sickening rhythm. These men were not just casually observing the neighborhood. They had positioned themselves with tactical precision, completely focused on a 7-year-old boy. My grandson. The financial devastation I had uncovered just minutes ago was no longer confined to hidden spreadsheets and offshore bank accounts. It had manifested into a terrifying physical reality. The massive debt Preston owed to this underground syndicate had triggered a violent ultimatum. They were sending a crystal-clear message to my son-in-law. They were showing him exactly what was at stake if he failed to deliver their money. They held Leo in their sights, turning an innocent child into collateral for a degenerate gambler's mistakes. I needed to move to run out to the driveway and drive straight to the school to pull Leo out of his classroom. But my disciplined mind held me back. If I panicked and alerted Valerie, Preston would instantly know his cover was blown. A desperate man cornered by a violent syndicate would become entirely unpredictable. He might attempt to grab Leo himself and run. I had to remain completely undetectable while I dismantled his trap. As I sat there agonizing over my next step, the silence of the guest house was abruptly shattered. At exactly 10:30 in the morning, my cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden surface of the desk. The sharp mechanical buzzing made me jump. I pulled my eyes away from the frozen surveillance image of the men in the black sedan and picked up the device. It was an automated security text message from a local banking institution. Years ago, when Valerie first started college, I had set up a joint emergency savings account for her. I wanted her to have a secure financial safety net that was easily accessible. When she married Preston, she kept the account active, though she rarely touched it. Because my name remained on the original charter as a secondary guarantor, the bank's security algorithms still sent me automatic alerts for any major unusual transactions. I opened the message and read the bold text. A massive withdrawal had just been initiated. Exactly $50,000 was currently being transferred out of the account and routed to an external digital wallet. I quickly logged into the banking portal to verify the available balance. The account was completely empty. That $50,000 was the absolute last drop of Valerie's liquid savings. Preston was not just skimming off the top anymore. He was violently scraping the bottom of the barrel, draining every single cent he could forcibly extract from his wife's safety net. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, forcing my racing mind to process this new variable. Why $50,000? Why right now at 10:30 in the morning, I began to map out the syndicate's timeline based on Preston's aggressive withdrawals over the past 48 hours. Yesterday, the syndicate sent Muscle to watch Leo at the elementary school, establishing the lethal consequence of failure. This morning, Preston was desperate enough to assault me just to hide a single piece of paper bearing a routing number. Now he was draining his wife's final emergency fund in broad daylight. The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. This was not a routine installment payment to keep the bookies at bay. This was the desperate behavior of a man who had completely run out of time. The $50,000 was merely a pathetic stalling tactic, a tiny fraction of the $3 million he owed them. He was gathering every loose scrap of cash to buy himself a few more hours of breathing room. The syndicate had given him a hard deadline. They were not waiting until the end of the month. They were not waiting until next week. Based on his sheer panic, I knew exactly when the grace period expired. They were coming to collect their money tonight. A wave of protective fury washed over me, stronger than the lingering physical pain radiating from my bruised spine. I was not going to let this polished fraud destroy my daughter's life. I was not going to let violent criminals anywhere near my grandson. I closed the laptop, securing the downloaded files and the encrypted ledgers. I had the absolute proof of his financial crimes, but I needed the strategic power to trap him before the sun went down. I stood up from the desk and walked quietly over to the front window of the guest house. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back just enough for me to see the main driveway of the estate. The bright morning sun illuminated the manicured lawn and the imported stone pavers. The heavy oak door of the main house opened, and Preston walked out into the crisp air. He had changed his shirt, replacing the one that likely bore a few drops of my blood. He looked perfectly composed, his hair flawlessly styled, his posture radiating that fake confidence he used to manipulate everyone around him. Valerie followed him onto the stone steps. She was smiling at him, a warm, trusting, completely loving smile. It sickened me to my core. I watched as Preston turned to her and wrapped his arms around her shoulders. He pulled her into a tight, affectionate embrace. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss against her forehead. It was the perfect picture of a devoted, loving husband heading off to a busy day of corporate meetings to provide for his family. He smiled at her, whispering something that made her laugh softly. She had no idea that the man holding her had just wiped out her last remaining bank account. She had no idea he was serving her up to a violent syndicate to save his own skin. I stood in the shadows of the guest house watching this grotesque theatrical performance play out on my driveway. Preston released his wife, gave her one final reassuring wave, and confidently stepped toward the garage. He climbed into his leased silver Porsche, the engine roaring to life with an aggressive, expensive growl. He backed smoothly out of the driveway, the tires crunching softly against the gravel. I watched the luxury vehicle accelerate down the private road, disappearing behind the tall, wrought-iron security gates. He was driving away to execute the next phase of his pathetic, doomed survival plan. Valerie turned and walked back inside the massive house, completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb sitting directly under her roof. I let the heavy curtain fall back into place, plunging my small room into a determined, focused darkness. My trembling was completely gone. I reached over to the solid wooden door and firmly engaged the deadbolt, locking myself securely inside. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and opened my contacts. I scrolled past the daily numbers down to a secure contact I had deliberately ignored for a very long time. I pressed the green call button, dialing a number I had not called in 5 years. The call connected on the second ring. A gruff, gravelly voice answered on the other end, sounding exactly as sharp and impatient as it had half a decade ago. It was Victor Rossi. Victor was my former corporate attorney, a veteran legal shark who had spent his entire career tearing apart hostile takeover bids and crushing fraudulent contractors in civil court. He was ruthless, deeply cynical, and fiercely loyal. When I retired, I put his number away, hoping I would never need his aggressive brand of legal warfare again. "Harrison Caldwell," Victor said, his voice echoing slightly over the speakerphone. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this call? Are you finally coming out of retirement to buy another skyscraper? Or did you just miss my charming personality?" I did not smile. "I do not have time for pleasantries today, Victor," I replied, keeping my voice low and completely steady. "I need you to pull up the master files for the Oak Brook estate, the mansion I built for Valerie and Preston. I need you to open the property deed and the secondary financial guarantees immediately." The humor instantly vanished from Victor's voice. He recognized the cold, clinical tone I only used when a major project was on the verge of a catastrophic failure. I heard the rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard on his end of the line. "Give me 30 seconds, Victor said. "What exactly is going on, Harrison? You sound like you are preparing to drop a nuclear bomb on a competitor." "I am," I said, staring out the window toward the empty driveway. "Preston has completely compromised his financial structure. He was fired from the investment bank 4 months ago for gross misconduct. He has secretly liquidated every single asset in Valerie's trust funds. He just drained her final emergency account an hour ago. He owes a $3 million debt to an underground sports betting syndicate, and they currently have spotters watching my grandson at his elementary school. Preston is planning to have me declared legally incompetent on Monday, so he can seize power of attorney and liquidate my estate to save his own skin." There was a heavy, stunned silence on the line, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of Victor's keyboard. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously calm. "Do you want me to call the federal authorities, or do you want me to freeze him out of the financial grid first?" Victor asked. "The police cannot protect little Leo from a syndicate hit squad before tonight," I explained, gripping the edge of my desk. Preston is their only payday. If I can instantly vaporize his access to this property and my assets, he becomes completely useless to them. I need to sever his financial lifeline right now. I need to execute the failsafe. I am looking at the deed right now, Victor said. You know, Harrison, when you first asked me to draft this paperwork, I thought you were being incredibly paranoid. Now I see you were just being an engineer. You built a back door into the foundation. He was absolutely right. When I handed over the keys to the $4 million mansion, Preston treated it like an unconditional coronation. He strutted through the massive marble foyer, acting as if he had personally earned every single square foot of the property. When the time came to sign the official transfer documents, his arrogance blinded him completely. He saw the shiny gold seal on the cover page and eagerly flipped straight to the back to sign his name on the dotted line. He never bothered to read the dense, heavily formatted legal text buried in the middle of the contract. If he had simply read the document, he would have realized the mansion was never a free and clear gift. I had instructed Victor to embed a highly specific, conditional, revocable trust clause deep within the property deed. On paper, Preston and Valerie were the primary residents and listed owners, but the trust explicitly stated that I retained the absolute right to unilaterally revoke their ownership stake and seize 100% control of the property if certain financial or legal conditions were severely breached. Criminal activity, gross financial negligence, and unauthorized liquidation of affiliated family assets were all explicitly listed as immediate triggers for the revocation clause. By draining Valerie's accounts and engaging with an illegal gambling syndicate, Preston had triggered every single tripwire I had carefully laid under his feet. The conditions for revocation have been spectacularly met, I told Victor, my voice hardening into steel. I want you to execute the clause right now. I want total uncontested ownership of the Oak Brook estate transferred back into my name immediately. Furthermore, I want you to contact the central banking authorities. Use my primary guarantor status to instantly freeze every single credit line, joint account, and equity loan attached to Preston's name or this address. He has been using the equity in this house to float his gambling debts. I want that vault locked down so tight he cannot even buy a cup of coffee. He thinks he is playing a high-stakes game with my money. It is time to clear the board. Consider it done, Victor said, the sound of his keyboard accelerating into a frantic, aggressive rhythm. I am generating the revocation notices now. I will file the electronic injunctions with the county courthouse and the banking regulators simultaneously. The digital lockouts should take effect within the hour. By the time Preston tries to access any of those equity lines this afternoon, he is going to hit a solid brick wall. Make absolutely certain there are no loopholes, I commanded, pacing across the hardwood floor of the guest house. He is desperate, Victor. He thinks he has until Monday to put me in a locked care facility and take everything. He thinks I am just a confused old man who cannot remember his own name. I want the ground to open up and swallow his finances before he even realizes what is happening. You have my word, Victor assured me. I am pushing the priority flags through the legal network right now. I am also submitting the secondary asset freeze to the Federal Banking Commission to halt any pending wire transfers he might have initiated this morning. I will personally guarantee that he cannot move a single cent of your family's money. I stopped pacing and took a slow, deep breath, feeling a tiny fraction of the immense pressure lift from my chest. Stripping Preston of his financial power was the first crucial step in neutralizing the immediate threat to my grandson. Once the syndicate realized Preston had zero access to the $4 million estate, they would know he was a dead end. Thank you, Victor, I said quietly. I will call you back when I have secured Valerie and Leo. Hold on for 1 second, Victor said. Victor ran a rapid title search to confirm the freeze. He stopped mid-sentence. Harrison, you need to look at what Preston filed with the county clerk yesterday morning. You aren't going to believe this. Send it to me right now, I demanded, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. A few seconds later, an encrypted email notification popped up on my laptop screen. I clicked the attachment, downloading a massive file containing the digitized public records from the county clerk. I opened the document and stared at the first page. It was a formal application for a home equity line of credit secured directly against the total appraised value of the Oak Brook estate. I checked the timestamp on the digital filing. It had been submitted yesterday morning, just hours before Preston began shredding his offshore bank statements in my library. I scrolled down to the second page of the legally binding document. My eyes locked onto the principal loan amount requested by the applicant. $2 million. I felt a cold surge of absolute fury radiate through my chest. Preston was attempting to leverage the very roof over my daughter's head to cover the massive deficit he owed to the violent sports betting syndicate. He knew the property possessed over $4 million in clear equity, and he was trying to extract exactly half of it in one desperate, catastrophic sweep. "Look at the final page, Harrison," Victor said over the speakerphone, his voice tight with restrained anger. "Look at the authorization signatures." I quickly scrolled past the dense financial disclosures and the standard banking boilerplate text to reach the final authorization section. There, sitting starkly on the white screen, were 3 digital signatures. The first was Preston's own signature. The second was a flawless, meticulously executed forgery of Valerie's signature. The third was a highly sophisticated, digitally duplicated copy of my own signature, acting as the primary guarantor for the massive loan. I stared at the glowing screen, my analytical mind processing the sheer audacity of the crime. Preston had not merely made a terrible financial mistake. He had systematically committed multiple counts of severe wire fraud, identity theft, and institutional banking fraud. He had actively forged his wife's name to steal $2 million of equity from a property she legally inhabited. He submitted the application through a highly expedited commercial lender. Victor explained, the rapid clicking of his keyboard echoing in the background. They specialize in rapid liquidity for high net worth clients. They bypassed the standard 30-day underwriting process by utilizing an automated collateral appraisal. The loan was approved late yesterday afternoon. The funds are currently sitting in a temporary escrow holding account. When is the final wire transfer scheduled to clear into his personal account? I asked, gripping the edge of my heavy wooden desk so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. "Today," Victor replied grimly. "The banking ledger indicates the final disbursement protocol will automatically execute at exactly 5 o'clock this evening. The moment the market closes, that $2 million will instantly drop into Preston's primary checking account. He is going to immediately wire those funds to the offshore syndicate to save his own life, and you will be left holding a massive fraudulent mortgage on a property you built with your own hands." The timeline crystallized in my mind with terrifying precision. The $50,000 Preston had drained from Valerie's emergency savings account this morning was just a desperate stalling tactic. He had likely promised the syndicate a small immediate down payment to keep their violent enforcers at bay until the massive $2 million equity loan cleared this evening. That was exactly why the unmarked black sedan had been watching little Leo outside of the elementary school. The syndicate was ensuring that Preston remained highly motivated to deliver the final payment by 5 o'clock. "We are going to stop that wire transfer right now," I commanded, my voice turning into a weapon of cold, calculating authority. "Victor, get the executive director of the commercial lenders fraud department on a secure conference call immediately. Do not speak to a standard customer service representative. Bypass the entire front desk protocol. Tell them that Harrison Caldwell, the primary legal guarantor on the pending $2 million Oak Brook estate loan, is officially reporting a massive identity theft and severe structural fraud. I am bridging the connection to their central fraud division right now." Victor said, his tone shifting into the ruthless, aggressive posture that made him a legend in the corporate courtrooms. "I am simultaneously transmitting your original structural trust documents and the certified revocation clause to their legal department. We are going to build a concrete wall around that escrow account." Within 3 minutes, Victor successfully merged a senior fraud investigator from the commercial lending institution into our secure digital line. I did not give the investigator a single second to recite his standard corporate greetings. I took absolute control of the conversation, wielding my vast corporate experience to dominate the narrative. Listen to me very carefully, I instructed the senior investigator, speaking with slow, deliberate articulation. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am the primary legal owner and the sole structural guarantor of the Oak Brook property currently leveraged under your pending $2 million equity loan. The signature acting as the guarantor on your application is a fraudulent digital duplicate. The secondary signature belonging to my daughter, Valerie Caldwell, is a malicious forgery. The primary applicant, Preston Hayes, is currently engaged in a massive money laundering scheme involving an illegal offshore gambling syndicate. If you allow that pending wire transfer to clear at 5 o'clock tonight, your institution will be legally complicit in facilitating a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The senior investigator was completely caught off guard by the sheer gravity of my precise accusations. Before he could attempt to verify my identity through standard security questions, Victor launched a devastating legal bombardment. "This is Victor Rossi, senior legal counsel for Mr. Caldwell," Victor stated aggressively. "I have just transmitted an encrypted file directly to your chief compliance officer. It contains the original property deed, the active revocable trust clause, and a formal cease and desist injunction filed with the county clerk not 10 minutes ago. We are officially placing a hard freeze on all related assets. If a single dollar leaves that escrow account, I will personally ensure your institution faces a crippling federal lawsuit for gross negligence and willful blindness to severe financial fraud." The senior investigator frantically typed on his end. "I am looking at your injunction right now, Mr. Rossi. I see the trust documents. The signatures on the loan application have been flagged for immediate secondary biometric review. I am initiating an emergency administrative override. The pending $2 million wire transfer is officially frozen. The funds are locked in our internal escrow divisions pending a comprehensive federal investigation. Preston Hayes cannot access this capital." I ended the secure call with grim satisfaction. With the $2 million wire permanently frozen, the syndicate would never get their money. Preston did not know that yet. He was driving into a massive trap. I locked my screen and dialed my second ally. It was time for Special Agent Mitchell of the FBI. I dialed the secure 10-digit number from memory. It had been nearly 8 years since I last spoke with Special Agent Thomas Mitchell. During my prime, my engineering firm handled structural assessments for high-profile federal buildings across the Midwest. Mitchell was the lead investigator on a massive corruption case involving a rival contracting firm. We had worked closely together, developing a deep mutual respect based on absolute precision and shared integrity. When he answered the secure line, his voice carried the same sharp, disciplined authority I remembered. I skipped the pleasantries, just as I had with Victor. The situation was deteriorating by the second, and I needed the immense power of the federal government on my side. I told Mitchell I was sending a heavily encrypted data packet directly to his secure federal server. I explained the situation with ruthless efficiency. I detailed the offshore routing numbers, the massive illegal wire transfers, and the direct connection to the underground sports betting syndicate. I told him about the men in the ill-fitting suits watching my grandson outside the elementary school yesterday. I needed his financial crimes division to run the Cayman Island accounts through the federal database immediately to identify the exact nature of the threat coming from my family. Mitchell did not ask unnecessary questions. He heard the cold, suppressed panic in my voice and told me he was personally taking the file to the cyber division. He promised to call me back within the hour. The wait was completely agonizing. It was exactly 1:30 in the afternoon. I paced the entire length of the guest house, my leather shoes scuffing softly against the polished hardwood floor. The silence of the sprawling estate felt oppressive, thick with the heavy weight of the impending violence. I kept glancing out the large front window at the main house. Valerie was inside, completely unaware that her entire life was a carefully constructed lie. She genuinely thought her husband was out providing for their family. She did not know he had already sold her out to a gang of violent criminals. I thought about little Leo sitting quietly in his elementary school classroom, completely vulnerable to the silent predators watching his building. I had to maintain my strict composure. I had to remain the cold, analytical, structural engineer. Every raw emotion was a deadly liability right now. I could not afford to make a single mistake while my daughter and grandson were in the direct line of fire. I reviewed my security protocols over and over in my mind, ensuring every digital access point was locked down. I checked the perimeter cameras again, searching the live feeds for any sign of approaching vehicles. The neighborhood remained deceptively calm, a quiet suburban illusion masking a lethal reality. I checked the reinforced locks on the guest house door, assuring myself that my temporary command center was entirely secure. At exactly 2:30, my cellular phone finally buzzed. I snatched the device off the wooden desk before the second ring could even register. "Harrison," Mitchell said, his voice unusually heavy and dark. "We ran the routing numbers you provided through the international database. The offshore accounts belong directly to the Petrov Syndicate. They are a highly organized, completely ruthless criminal operation based out of Eastern Europe. They do not just collect unpaid debts. They make brutal public examples of people who cross them. If someone owes them $3 million, they do not negotiate extended payment plans. They send a specialized tactical team to extract the total payment in blood. They are extremely precise and overwhelmingly violent. They leave absolutely no witnesses behind." My grip on the phone tightened until the black plastic casing groaned under the intense pressure of my fingers. "Preston tried to secure a $2 million equity loan against my property this morning to pay them off." I explained rapidly, my voice tight with lingering adrenaline. "My corporate attorney froze the electronic wire transfer an hour ago. The syndicate is not going to get their money from that specific account. We successfully cut off his financial supply line." "Harrison, listen to me very carefully," Mitchell said, his professional tone dropping to a grim, terrifying whisper that chilled my blood. "We dug much deeper into Preston's recent financial footprint. My cyber team intercepted a series of highly encrypted digital communications between his personal server and a secondary offshore broker. He is not trying to pay the syndicate off with the house money. That forged equity loan was just a desperate, calculated smokescreen to distract you and the banks. It was a massive diversion." I stopped pacing immediately. The air inside the small room felt suddenly freezing. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my chest tightening with an overwhelming sense of dread. 2 months ago, right after he was officially terminated from the investment bank, Preston took out a massive, comprehensive life insurance policy, Mitchell revealed slowly. He used a private, unregulated broker to completely bypass the standard corporate background checks and psychiatric evaluations. The policy specifically covers accidental death, violent home invasion, and fatal casualties resulting from a criminal act. "Who is the policy for?" I asked, my voice barely a breathless, trembling rasp. "It is on Valerie," Mitchell said, the words hanging heavily in the quiet room. "He insured your daughter for exactly $5 million. He is the sole exclusive beneficiary on the paperwork. The private policy went fully active 48 hours ago." The solid hardwood floor seemed to drop completely out from beneath my feet. The sheer sociopathic evil of Preston's grand plan washed over me in a suffocating, toxic wave. He was never going to pay the brutal syndicate with his own money. He absolutely never intended to fix his massive gambling mistakes. He was orchestrating a slaughter. He was trading the life of the woman who loved him for a massive corporate payout to erase his personal debts. The pieces connected perfectly. His fake concern about my failing memory this morning. The rush to get me transferred to a highly secure nursing facility. He needed me entirely removed from the estate tonight. He needed me locked far away in a padded room while the armed intruders breached the perimeter. Valerie would be left completely alone in the massive house. It was a perfectly designed execution. I saw the terrifying scene playing out clearly. The syndicate enforcers arriving under the cover of darkness, the disabled alarms, the violent struggle. Preston would play the role of the devastated grieving widower to perfection. He would collect the $5 million, pay his massive gambling debts, and walk away a very wealthy man. He knows the $2 million wire transfer is going to fail. Mitchell continued, his voice dripping with absolute professional disgust. He probably expected you to catch the forged signatures eventually. He does not care if the banks lock him out. He tipped the violent syndicate off to his own home address for tonight. He intentionally provided them the external security gate codes and the internal floor plan of the massive mansion. He is serving them his wife to collect the payout. The magnitude of the revelation hung in the guest house. Preston was not merely a desperate gambler drowning in massive debt. He was a sociopath who placed a price tag on my daughter's life. He engineered this entire scenario, ensuring he would be far away with an ironclad alibi, while violent syndicate enforcers breached our perimeter. He manipulated everyone, isolating me with the dementia lie so Valerie would be utterly defenseless. The sheer evil of his plan eradicated any remaining fear. My trembling vanished completely. The localized pain from my spine dulled. I felt a profound internal shift. The structural engineer stepped fully into the light. "We need to move immediately, Harrison," Agent Mitchell said, his voice tense with urgency over the encrypted line. "I am authorizing a tactical response unit right now. We will secure Valerie, sweep the perimeter, and intercept Preston. We can end this." "No," I replied, my tone possessing the cold edge of a forged steel blade. "You will not raid this house. You will not send a tactical team with sirens blaring, and you will not tip Preston off." "Harrison, you are not thinking clearly," Mitchell argued. "You are dealing with professional killers. The Petrov syndicate does not leave loose ends. We have to secure the targets." "I am thinking with perfect clarity," I countered. "Look at the variables on the board. Preston is a cornered animal. He knows his wire transfer will fail at 5 o'clock. If he sees police cruisers on the local news, or if a tactical unit kicks down his office door, his survival instincts will override everything. He will realize his operation has collapsed. What do you think a desperate man does when his trap is exposed?" Mitchell fell silent on the other end of the line, processing the psychological profile of our target. "He will run," I continued. "And he will not run alone. He is the legal father of my grandson. If Preston gets spooked, he will drive straight to that elementary school and take Leo as a human shield. I will not allow my grandson to be dragged into a federal manhunt. We cannot force a confrontation while Leo remains exposed." "So what is your structural solution, Harrison?" Mitchell asked, relenting to my logic. "How do we dismantle the trap without triggering the explosive?" "We control the foundation," I stated firmly. "We let Preston believe his plan is executing flawlessly. We let the syndicate believe the perimeter is soft and unguarded. But first, we extract the primary vulnerability. I need you to secure Leo. Not with uniformed officers, not with flashing lights. I need invisible ghosts." "I can deploy plainclothes agents to the school immediately," Mitchell confirmed. "We can coordinate directly with the principal. We will pull Leo from his afternoon classes under the guise of an exclusive after-school workshop. We will quietly escort him out through a secure staff exit and transport him to a safe house. Preston will simply receive a polite administrative email stating his son has been selected for an extended program that runs until late this evening." "Do it," I commanded. "Do not let Preston anywhere near that child. Call me the exact second my grandson is locked down." I ended the call and checked the digital clock on my laptop screen. It was exactly 2:30 in the afternoon. Valerie had left an hour ago for her weekly charity committee meeting in the city, an event Preston had specifically encouraged her to attend, so she would be out of the house while he finalized his deadly logistics. I was completely alone on the sprawling $4 million estate. The massive residence was a silent, empty fortress waiting for the impending breach. I slipped my laptop into my satchel and unlocked the heavy wooden door of the guest house. I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, scanning the courtyard. The grounds were flawlessly silent. I walked briskly toward the main residence, my mind churning through the security schematics I had designed years ago. Preston had installed an expensive smart home security system. It allowed him to monitor the interior camera's motion sensors and digital door locks directly from an application on his smartphone. He undoubtedly planned to watch the live feeds tonight, eager to witness the syndicate enforcers entering the house, eager to see the exact moment he became a very wealthy widower. I keyed my master access code into the side entrance and stepped into the massive marble-tiled kitchen. I did not have much time. I moved systematically through the silent rooms. I located the primary smart home hub discreetly mounted inside the pantry wall. Preston was a brilliant manipulator, but he was completely technologically illiterate. He trusted the wireless cloud-based interfaces, completely ignorant of the hardwired physical bypasses I had hidden within the drywall during the initial construction. I opened my thick leather satchel and carefully extracted a small localized digital routing device. I spliced the device directly into the main coaxial feed leading into Preston's smart hub. With a few rapid keystrokes on my laptop, I effectively severed the smart home system from the external internet without triggering a single offline alarm on his mobile application. I initiated a closed-loop broadcast protocol. I took the normal video feeds recorded from yesterday afternoon, featuring empty hallways, undisturbed living rooms, and peaceful silence, and I looped them continuously into Preston's remote viewing feed. If Preston checked his phone from his fake corporate office right now, he would see absolute undisturbed tranquility. If he checked his phone tonight when the syndicate killers arrived, he would see the exact same fabricated peace. He would be completely blind to the reality unfolding inside the house. I was blinding the architect of this slaughter, severing his digital eyes and isolating him in the dark. My cell phone buzzed softly in my pocket. I pulled it out and read the encrypted text message from Agent Mitchell. The operation at the elementary school was a complete success. 2 plainclothes federal agents had smoothly extracted little Leo under the pretense of a gifted student evaluation. The young boy was happily eating chocolate ice cream in a highly secured federal safe room, surrounded by heavily armed guards. He was completely safe. The last vulnerability had been successfully removed from the board. I let out a long, heavy breath, feeling a profound sense of absolute relief wash over my bruised shoulders. The board was cleared. The trap was set. Preston's plan was quietly crumbling beneath his polished leather shoes, and he was completely unaware of the structural failure. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked slowly into the center of the sprawling kitchen. The sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the pristine granite countertops and the polished stainless steel appliances. The house was quiet, but it was no longer a tomb waiting for a victim. It was a reinforced bunker preparing to trap its predators. I rolled up the sleeves of my heavy cotton-collared shirt, feeling the cold, determined energy settling into my aching bones. Valerie would be home soon. Now it is finally time for me to cook. The silence of the kitchen wrapped around me like a heavy protective blanket. I walked over to the custom mahogany pantry and pulled out a thick linen apron. It was a gift Valerie had bought for me years ago, back when my weekends were spent hosting massive family barbecues instead of dismantling violent criminal conspiracies. I slipped the heavy fabric over my head and tied the strings tightly behind my back. The familiar weight of the apron grounded me, anchoring my racing thoughts to the immediate physical reality of the room. It was exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I had less than 2 hours before the trap snapped completely shut, and I intended to use every single minute of that time to perfect my final presentation. I moved to the massive double-door refrigerator and pulled out a prime center-cut beef tenderloin. It was an expensive, beautiful cut of meat, completely flawless and rich in color. It was also the primary ingredient for beef Wellington, which happened to be Preston's absolute favorite meal. He always requested it for his birthday, praising the rich, complex layers of puff pastry, mushroom duxelles, and prosciutto. He loved the dish because it felt incredibly wealthy, completely decadent, and entirely self-indulgent. He loved it because it mirrored the exact lifestyle he so desperately tried to project to the rest of the world. I placed the heavy tenderloin on the thick wooden cutting board in the center of the kitchen island. I patted the meat completely dry with a paper towel, feeling the dense, cold muscle under my fingertips. Preparing a proper beef Wellington requires absolute patience, meticulous construction, and a very sharp blade. You cannot rush the process without completely ruining the final result. You have to sear the exterior perfectly to lock everything inside. Then you have to coat it, wrap it tightly, and subject it to intense searing heat until the raw bleeding center is completely transformed. It was the perfect poetic metaphor for the psychological warfare I was actively staging against my son-in-law. I reached into the wooden knife block on the counter and withdrew my best carving knife. It was a heavy professional-grade chef's blade crafted from high-carbon steel. I pulled my sharpening steel from the drawer. I held the heavy rod in my left hand and positioned the base of the knife blade against the textured metal. I drew the steel edge down the rod with a swift, fluid motion. The sharp, metallic scraping sound echoed loudly throughout the silent, empty kitchen. I repeated the motion, settling into a steady, rhythmic cadence. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The harsh noise bounced off the granite countertops and the vaulted ceiling, filling the pristine room with the raw, industrial sound of active preparation. With every single stroke of the metal, I thought about the man who had assaulted me in my library this morning. I thought about the sheer blinding arrogance required to look a father in the eye and lie about his own sanity. Preston truly believed he was a master manipulator. He thought his tailored suits and his leased luxury cars made him completely untouchable. He viewed everyone around him, including his own wife and his young son, as completely disposable assets meant to serve his own selfish survival. He had spent months carefully layering his lies, wrapping his failures in thick sheets of deception, and presenting a beautiful golden facade to the world. But a facade is simply a fragile pastry shell. It is thin, delicate, and entirely hollow on the inside. I flipped the heavy knife over and drew the opposite edge down the sharpening steel. I was going to carve right through his beautiful facade. I was going to strip him of his unearned pride, his fraudulent wealth, and his pathetic illusions of control. I would peel back his lies layer by layer, exposing the raw, bleeding coward underneath. He thought he had outsmarted me by transferring his massive debts to my property. He thought he could serve his own wife to a violent gambling syndicate and walk away completely clean. He was absolutely wrong. By 5 o'clock tonight, his fraudulent equity loan would be officially flagged as a federal crime. His access to every single bank account would be completely frozen by my corporate attorney. His targeted victims, my daughter and my grandson, would be completely removed from his toxic orbit by armed federal agents. He would walk through the front door of this massive mansion, expecting to find me locked away in a secure dementia ward, and his wife waiting blindly for the slaughter. Instead, he would find absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of his own monumental failures. I wiped the newly sharpened blade clean and prepared the tenderloin, seasoning it generously with sea salt. I placed a cast iron skillet on the gas stove, turning the blue flame to its maximum height. I poured oil into the pan, waiting until it smoked faintly. I gently laid the beef into the heat. The loud hiss of searing meat filled the kitchen. I stood completely still, watching the meat turn a deep brown against the iron. I turned the tenderloin carefully, ensuring every side was perfectly sealed. Once browned, I removed it from the heat. I began chopping the fresh brown mushrooms, the very sharp blade moving with flawless precision. I minced fresh shallots and raw garlic, blending them into a rich, dark paste in the hot iron skillet. I poured a splash of dry white wine into the pan, watching the liquid bubble and evaporate into a thick, fragrant steam. The smell of the rich cooking filled the entire house, masking the cold, clinical reality of the trap I had built. I rolled out the delicate puff pastry on the flowered counter, laying down a thin sheet of imported prosciutto. I spread the dark mushroom paste evenly across the cured meat, creating a dark, earthy bed for the seared beef. I placed the heavy tenderloin in the center and carefully rolled the pastry over the top, sealing the edges tightly with a brush of beaten egg wash. The preparation was completely flawless. The meal was ready for the fire. I placed the wrapped beef onto a heavy baking sheet and slid it into the preheated oven. I set the digital timer for exactly 45 minutes. I washed my hands in the sink, drying them slowly on a clean towel. I leaned against the kitchen counter, listening to the steady, rhythmic ticking of the oven timer. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. I watched the afternoon sunlight shift across the hardwood floor, casting long, dark shadows into the corners of the room. The house remained perfectly, completely silent. I took a deep breath, focusing my mind on the final confrontation. 5:30. 5:40. The tension in the air was incredibly thick, vibrating with the silent hum of impending destruction. At exactly 5:45, the digital oven timer began to beep with a sharp, piercing alarm. At that exact same second, the heavy front door of the mansion unlocked with a loud metallic click. Preston is home. The heavy oak door swung open, closing with a solid thud that echoed through the foyer. I stood by the kitchen island, my hands resting on the cold granite countertop. The tapping of his polished leather shoes against the marble tiles signaled his approach. He moved with a relaxed, arrogant stride, carrying the posture of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. He walked into the kitchen, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his hands adjusting the knot of his silk tie. He paused in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the pristine countertops and the lingering smoke from the seared meat. When his gaze landed on me standing quietly in my linen apron, a condescending smirk spread across his flawlessly groomed face. He did not see an enraged father ready to dismantle his existence. He saw a defeated, broken old man who had finally accepted his pathetic fate. He chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound that grated against my ears. "Making yourself useful before the nursing home. Old man?" he asked, his voice dripping with unadulterated venom. The audacity of the insult sent a spike of white heat into my chest. I wanted to reach across the island and tear the smug satisfaction off his face. But an engineer knows premature detonation ruins the demolition. I forced the burning rage down into my stomach, locking it away behind a constructed wall of absolute submission. I lowered my posture, allowing my shoulders to slump in a display of weary resignation. I let my hands tremble a fraction of an inch, mimicking the insecurity of a man losing his grip on reality. "I am sorry," I mumbled deliberately, letting my voice waver. "I wanted to apologize for my confusion this morning. My memory has been so cloudy lately. I overreacted. I know you are only trying to help me, Preston. I just wanted to make peace." I turned toward the custom wine cooler, retrieving a rare bottle of Bordeaux he coveted. I pulled the cork, slowly poured a measure into a crystal goblet, and slid it across the marble island toward him. "I made your favorite," I added quietly, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor, "to show my gratitude." Preston picked up the crystal glass, swirling the crimson liquid, with an arrogant flick of his wrist. He held the goblet up to the light, inspecting the color, before taking a long, satisfied sip. He looked at me over the rim, his eyes gleaming with triumphant mockery. He truly believed he had won. He believed his psychological manipulation had broken my spirit entirely. Before he could deliver another insult, the click of high heels sounded on the wooden staircase. Valerie descended into the main hallway, oblivious to the lethal, invisible war raging inside her home. She walked into the kitchen looking radiant in a dark blue evening dress. She perfectly fulfilled her role as a dedicated wife. Her eyes shifted from Preston standing casually with his wine to me, standing submissively in my apron. A bright, relieved smile illuminated her face. "See, Preston," she said, her voice carrying a light musical tone that broke my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. "I told you Dad would come around. He just needed a little time to adjust to the arrangements." She walked across the kitchen and wrapped her arms around her husband, resting her head against his chest. Preston wrapped his free arm around her waist, pressing a fake kiss into her hair. He looked right at me over her shoulder, his smirk widening into a grin of total supremacy. He was flaunting his absolute control over my daughter, silently daring me to challenge him again. I forced a weak, agreeable smile onto my face, nodding silently at my daughter's tragic optimism. She had no idea the man holding her had secretly placed a $5 million bounty on her head. She did not know he had provided her home address to a ruthless syndicate of professional killers. She thought we were finally having a peaceful family dinner. I turned away from the sickening display of false affection and focused my attention on the oven. The digital timer read exactly 6 o'clock. The intense heat washed over my face as I opened the metal door. The beef Wellington was a masterpiece. The golden puff pastry was baked to a flawless, crispy perfection, trapping the rich, savory juices inside. I extracted the heavy baking sheet, setting it onto the granite counter. The aromatic steam filled the room, a blend of roasted garlic butter and perfectly cooked beef. It was the smell of wealth, comfort, and absolute security. It was the ultimate illusion. I transferred the Wellington onto a large silver serving platter, arranging roasted vegetables around the golden crust. I moved with slow, deliberate precision, acting the part of the obedient servant in my own house. "It smells incredible, Dad," Valerie said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "You really outdid yourself tonight. Let me help you set the dining room table." I shook my head, maintaining my fragile, subservient persona. "No, sweetheart," I replied softly, picking up the silver platter. "You sit down and relax. You have had a very long day. Let me take care of everything tonight." Preston chuckled again, taking another long sip of his expensive Bordeaux. "Listen to the man, Valerie," he said smoothly. "He wants to make amends. We should let him serve us." I carried the heavy platter out of the kitchen and walked down the wide hallway toward the formal dining room. The massive mahogany dining table stretched out in the center of the room. I set the silver platter in the center of the wooden table. I arranged the silver cutlery, crystal glasses, and folded linen napkins. Valerie and Preston followed me into the room, their voices echoing against the coffered ceilings. Preston moved directly to the head of the table, taking his usual seat of honor with absolute entitlement. He sat back in the leather chair, crossing his legs and swirling the remnants of his wine. Valerie took her place to his right, smiling brightly as she admired the lavish feast I had prepared. I stood at the edge of the table, my hands resting at my sides. For the past 3 years, I had always taken the quiet, unassuming seat on the far left side, deferring entirely to Preston's dominance. I had always allowed him to command the room. I reached down and untied the strings of my apron, pulling the heavy fabric over my head. I draped it silently over the back of a nearby chair. I did not move toward my usual seat on the side. Instead, I walked with perfectly measured steps down the entire length of the mahogany table. I stopped at the opposite head of the table. I placed my hands on the back of the tall leather chair, directly facing Preston. I pulled the chair out, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor, and sat down. I looked straight down the length of the table, locking my eyes onto his. The fragile, broken old man vanished completely. The cold, relentless structural engineer had officially arrived. The interrogation is about to begin. The dining room was bathed in the warm light of the crystal chandelier. It was exactly 6:30 in the evening. The only sound in the massive room was the polite clinking of heavy silver forks and knives against porcelain plates. The air was incredibly tense, stretched so tight, it felt as though the slightest sudden movement might shatter the entire atmosphere. Valerie sat to my left, completely oblivious to the lethal current running between her husband and her father. She smiled brightly, taking a small bite of the roasted vegetables before launching into an enthusiastic summary of her afternoon. She talked about the charity committee meeting in the city, detailing the fundraising goals for the local children's hospital and the beautiful floral arrangements they had selected for the upcoming gala. Her voice was light, filled with a beautiful, tragic innocence. I sat perfectly still at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. I listened to my daughter speak, nodding politely at the appropriate intervals, but my eyes never left Preston. He sat at the head of the table, cutting into the thick slice of beef Wellington I had served him. He chewed the tender meat with an expression of deep satisfaction, taking another slow sip of his expensive Bordeaux. He looked completely relaxed, playing the role of the successful, loving husband, providing a lavish life for his family. He had no idea that I knew every single detail of his grotesque betrayal. I picked up my carving knife and sliced through the golden puff pastry on my own plate. The rich, savory aroma of the mushroom paste and the perfectly seared beef drifted upward. I took a measured bite, chewing slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Preston shift slightly in his leather chair. I set my silverware down on the edge of the porcelain plate. I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, folding it neatly before placing it beside my glass. "Valerie," I said softly, interrupting her cheerful description of the charity gala. "That sounds like a wonderful event. I am very glad you are dedicating your time to such a worthy cause." She smiled warmly at me. "Thank you, Dad. I really think we are going to make a huge difference this year." I shifted my gaze back down the length of the long mahogany table, locking my eyes directly onto Preston's flawlessly groomed face. He was in the middle of lifting his crystal goblet to his mouth. "Tell me, Preston," I said, keeping my voice completely casual, possessing the polite tone of a man asking about the weather. "Does the meat taste as rich as the $50,000 you drained from Valerie's emergency savings account at exactly 10:30 this morning?" The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. Valerie froze completely. Her silver fork stopped entirely midair, an inch from her mouth. Her bright smile vanished, replaced by a mask of total confusion. She blinked rapidly, her eyes darting back and forth between me and her husband. Preston violently choked on his wine. He inhaled a sharp breath of the dark liquid, coughing loudly and violently as his face flushed a deep, panicked red. He slammed the crystal goblet down onto the table, splashing drops of red wine across the pristine white linen tablecloth. He grabbed his napkin and wiped his mouth frantically, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw a clear breath. The polished, arrogant facade he had worn for years shattered into 1,000 tiny, pathetic pieces in a matter of seconds. "Dad," Valerie whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "What are you talking about? What $50,000? Preston held up a trembling hand, his eyes wide and darting like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. He coughed one last time, forcing a strained artificial chuckle from his throat. He was desperate to deploy a plausible lie, desperate to rebuild the illusion before it collapsed entirely. "Valerie, honey, please," Preston gasped, forcing his voice to sound calm and reassuring. "Your father is just confused again. He does not understand modern finance. It was not a withdrawal. It was a strategic transfer. I moved that money into a high-yield mutual fund. The market conditions were absolutely perfect this morning, and I wanted to maximize our return on investment. I was going to tell you about it tonight after dinner. It is a completely standard wealth management procedure." He looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to accept the lie, pleading for me to retreat back into the role of the broken, confused old man. He needed me to be quiet. Valerie looked at him desperately, wanting to believe the reassuring words of her husband. She nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing, just a fraction of an inch. "A mutual fund," she repeated softly. "Okay. Yes, that makes sense. Dad, you know Preston handles all of our investments. You do not need to worry about those things." I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I maintained the cold, analytical demeanor of a structural engineer dismantling a condemned building. I reached into the front pocket of my discarded linen apron resting on the chair beside me. I pulled out a single folded piece of white paper. It was the printed confirmation document Victor had sent me over the secure, encrypted connection just hours ago. I unfolded the paper with slow, deliberate precision. The crisp sound of the paper echoed in the silent dining room. I placed my hand flat against the document and slid it smoothly down the length of the polished mahogany table. The paper glided across the wood, coming to a perfect stop directly in front of Preston's plate. He stared down at the document as if it were a venomous snake. His face drained of all remaining color, turning a sickly translucent white. He read the bold black text, his eyes scanning the official letterhead of the commercial lending institution, the undeniable proof of his massive fraud, and the confirmation of the absolute freeze placed on the account. He saw his own forged signatures, and he saw the permanent injunction blocking his access to the money. "That is not a mutual fund prospectus, Preston," I stated, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "That is the official confirmation of a $2 million home equity line of credit you attempted to take out against this estate yesterday morning. A loan you secured by maliciously forging my signature and the signature of your wife." Valerie gasped loudly, dropping her fork onto her plate with a sharp clatter. She covered her mouth with trembling hands, staring at her husband in horror. Preston opened his mouth to speak, to offer another lie, but no words came out. His vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his exposure. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. I looked deep into his terrified, empty eyes. "I stopped the wire, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper that carried the full weight of a death sentence. "The syndicate is not getting their money today." The silence in the dining room became absolute heavy and completely suffocating. The polished mahogany table stretched between us like a battlefield, the untouched beef Wellington resting in the center, rapidly losing its warmth beneath the chandelier. Preston stared at the printed confirmation document, his chest heaving erratically beneath his tailored shirt. The color had completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified shell of a man. His mouth opened and closed silently, struggling to find a single thread of a lie that could possibly repair the catastrophic damage. But there was no lie left in his arsenal. The structural integrity of his entire fraudulent existence had just suffered a massive, undeniable collapse. Valerie remained frozen in her chair, her eyes wide with a growing frantic terror. She looked at the stark white paper sitting in front of her husband, then looked up at his pale, sweating face. She did not understand the intricate financial mechanics of a home equity line of credit. But she understood the raw, unadulterated fear radiating from the man she loved. She understood that the absolute safety of her world was shattering into pieces right in front of her eyes. The grandfather clock in the corner of the dining room chimed heavily, signaling the arrival of 7 o'clock in the evening. The deep, resonant ringing sound seemed to snap the invisible tether holding Preston's sanity together. He pushed himself violently away from the table, his chair scraping loudly across the polished hardwood floor. He began to pace frantically near the head of the long table, running his trembling hands through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the flawless image he worked so tirelessly to maintain. He was completely trapped in a cage of his own making. The $2 million he desperately needed to pay off the Eastern European betting syndicate was locked inside an impenetrable federal vault. He had zero financial leverage left. I remained perfectly still in my tall chair, my hands resting calmly on the table. I watched him pace back and forth, observing the precise physical manifestation of a man realizing his imminent demise. I had systematically stripped away his power, his stolen wealth, and his manufactured authority, leaving only a desperate, cornered predator in his place. Valerie stood up slowly, her linen napkin falling onto the floor. Her voice shook with emotion as she reached a trembling hand out toward him. She begged him to explain what was happening, to tell her that this was all just a terrible, confusing misunderstanding. She pleaded with him to assure her that her father was simply confused and entirely wrong. Preston abruptly stopped pacing. He turned toward her, but he did not look at her with love or any form of reassurance. He looked at her with wild, manic desperation and pure panic. Then he turned his frantic gaze down the entire length of the table toward me. His panic instantly mutated into a volatile, explosive, and blinding rage. He lunged forward and slammed his clenched fist violently onto the mahogany table. The heavy impact rattled the crystal goblets, sending dark drops of expensive Bordeaux spilling across the pristine white linen cloth. He leaned far over the table, his face contorted in absolute fury. "You senile old fool!" Preston screamed, his voice breaking into a harsh, ragged shriek that echoed violently off the coffered ceilings. "You have absolutely no idea what you have just done. You think you are protecting this family. You just signed our death warrants tonight. You completely destroyed my only way out of this nightmare. They are coming here tonight. Do you hear me? They are coming right now, and they are not going to leave until they get exactly what they are owed." His confession rang clearly through the room, completely destroying any lingering doubt. Valerie recoiled violently, stumbling backward, until her shaking shoulders hit the wall. The color completely drained from her face as she stared at her husband, finally seeing the monstrous stranger hiding behind the polished facade. Preston stood panting heavily, his knuckles turning white against the dark wood of the table, waiting for me to react with terror, waiting for me to sagpay him for a solution. I did not flinch at all. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms against the edge of the table, and let the cold, unforgiving authority of my true nature fill the large room. My voice turned into pure, freezing ice as I looked at him. "I know exactly what I have done, Preston," I stated, delivering each word with lethal precision. "I know about the $3 million debt you owe to the Petrov syndicate. I know you were officially fired from the investment bank 4 months ago for gross financial misconduct. I know you secretly liquidated every single asset in my daughter's trust fund to cover your pathetic gambling losses." Preston physically recoiled as if he had been struck hard by a heavy, invisible blow. His mouth dropped open, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror and shock. He realized in that agonizing, breathless moment that I had never been the confused, vulnerable old man he thought he was brilliantly manipulating. He realized I had been completely aware of his crimes from the very start, watching him from the shadows, dismantling his operation piece by piece. But I was not finished yet. I had one final, devastating layer to expose. "And I know," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, deadly register, "about the $5 million life insurance policy you secretly took out on my daughter." The silence that followed was absolute. Valerie let out an agonizing gasp of pure, shattered heartbreak. She pressed her hands over her mouth, trembling violently, as the horrifying reality of his grand design finally crashed down upon her. She looked at Preston, her eyes filled with a desperate plea for him to deny it, to tell her he had not placed a value on her life. Preston could not meet her gaze. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his mind completely fractured. He knew that I understood everything. He knew that the syndicate enforcers he had invited into this home tonight would find a reinforced trap instead of an easy target. He knew that little Leo was safely secured miles away in a federal facility completely out of his reach. The realization crashed over him like a suffocating wave. His entire world had collapsed in the span of 30 minutes. The man he thought was a clueless victim held absolutely all the cards. Preston was facing federal prison, violent retaliation from the syndicate, and the total destruction of his life. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. His panicked eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape, searching for any possible weapon to regain control of the room. His frantic gaze landed on the center of the mahogany table. Resting next to the golden crust of the beef Wellington gleaming under the warm light of the crystal chandelier was the heavy, high carbon steel carving knife I had freshly sharpened. With a sudden, terrifying burst of desperate animalistic speed, Preston lunged forward and grabbed the heavy handle of the blade. He moved with the chaotic, uncoordinated speed of a completely desperate, cornered animal. The heavy, high carbon steel carving knife flashed brightly under the warm glow of the crystal chandelier, sweeping upward in a sudden, highly violent arc. Valerie unleashed a piercing, guttural scream of absolute terror, stumbling backward over her own feet in her elegant, dark blue evening dress, and crashing hard against the ornate wooden wainscoting of the dining room wall. Preston did not even bother to look back at her. His eyes were completely bloodshot, bulging outward, with a manic, murderous intensity as he launched his entire body across the polished surface of the massive mahogany table. The delicate crystal wine goblets shattered instantly beneath the crushing weight of his aggressively driving knees. The large silver serving platter clattered violently against the floor, sending the perfectly cooked beef Wellington tumbling across the imported marble tiles in a tragically chaotic display of completely ruined domestic peace. "You have ruined absolutely everything!" Preston roared at me, his voice tearing painfully through his tight throat in a ragged, terrifying shriek that echoed off the high coffered ceilings. He scrambled frantically across the dark wood, leaving a trail of destruction, the sharp tip of the heavy carving knife pointed directly toward the exact center of my chest. "I am not going down alone, you arrogant, senile old fool!" he screamed loudly, saliva flying from his quivering lips in a grotesque display of completely unhinged panic. "You do not understand the violent people you are dealing with right now. They are going to brutally murder us all, and it is entirely your fault. I will kill you right here and now." I did not stand up. I did not raise my hands in a desperate attempt to physically defend my vulnerable body from the impending physical assault. I simply sat perfectly still in the tall leather chair at the head of the table, watching the pathetic, frantic trajectory of his violent approach with the detached observation of a scientist monitoring a deeply flawed experiment. He truly believed crude physical intimidation was his ultimate trump card in this deadly game. He genuinely thought he could blindly bully his way out of a meticulously engineered structural collapse. He was so entirely consumed by his own desperate fury that he completely failed to notice my right hand resting calmly inside the deep pocket of my tailored trousers. My thumb rested firmly against the textured surface of a small wireless remote transmitter. As Preston's left knee slammed heavily onto the exact center of the table, scattering the remaining silver forks and crisp linen napkins into the air, I pressed the button. A loud, sharp electronic hum instantly vibrated through the reinforced walls of the luxurious mansion. At exactly 7:30 in the evening, the massive double doors leading directly into the adjoining formal banquet room automatically unlatched and swung wide open. The heavy velvet blackout curtains, which had been drawn tightly shut throughout the entire day to conceal the interior activity from the outside world, motorized rapidly backward. A blinding array of overhead recessed lights snapped on with a synchronized heavy mechanical click, completely flooding the adjacent room with a stark, brilliant, and entirely unforgiving illumination. Preston froze completely solid. He stopped dead in the absolute center of the ruined dining table, the razor-sharp carving knife hovering entirely uselessly in his violently trembling fist. His ragged, uneven breathing hitched sharply in his chest as he slowly mechanically turned his head toward the sudden blinding burst of brilliant light spilling heavily through the wide-open doorway. Sitting perfectly still around the extended mahogany banquet table, barely 30 feet away from the chaotic scene of the assault, were 5 highly trained men. They had not just rushed frantically through the front door. They had been patiently sitting there in absolute darkness for the past 2 agonizing hours, waiting in total, absolute, disciplined silence while I methodically conducted my severe psychological interrogation. At the far end of this banquet table sat Victor Rossi, my ruthless corporate attorney, his hands steepled thoughtfully beneath his chin. He stared at Preston with an expression of profound, icy, professional disgust. Sitting directly next to him was Special Agent Thomas Mitchell of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, wearing a dark gray suit and a cold, predatory expression that silently promised absolute ruin. Flanking the 2 men were 3 broad-shouldered, heavily armed plainclothes federal agents, their postures rigid and highly alert. Resting in the very center of their polished table was a highly sophisticated digital audio receiver. A bright green light blinked steadily on its display panel, actively broadcasting every single word, every desperate threat, and every damning confession Preston had just screamed into the closed-loop surveillance microphones I had discreetly embedded inside the crystal dining room chandelier earlier this afternoon. The absolute silence that suddenly fell over the sprawling estate was entirely deafening. The only distinct sound remaining in the entire room was the frantic, shallow panting echoing weakly from Preston's tightening throat as he struggled to breathe. His terrified eyes darted rapidly from the seated federal agents to the blinking audio receiver and finally back down the length of the table toward me. The heavy steel carving knife began to shake violently in his sweaty grip, the metal blade catching the bright overhead light. The horrifying reality of his situation crashed down upon his shoulders with the immense crushing weight of a collapsing skyscraper. He finally realized he was not a brilliant criminal mastermind who had successfully orchestrated a flawless corporate takeover. He was merely a pathetic rat who had voluntarily crawled directly into a reinforced steel trap, entirely oblivious to the heavy iron door, permanently locking shut behind his back. I had intentionally allowed him to completely verbally confess to severe financial fraud, massive wire manipulation, and his deadly insurance conspiracy with a captive audience of federal prosecutors intently listening to his every single desperate syllable in real time. Valerie remained pressed tightly against the far wall, her pale hands trembling uncontrollably as she desperately struggled to mentally process the completely impossible scene rapidly unfolding before her tearful eyes. She looked closely at her father sitting incredibly calmly and perfectly composed at the head of the ruined table, and then stared down at her husband kneeling pitifully like a cornered, highly violent maniac with a deadly weapon clutched tightly in his sweating hand. The beautiful romantic illusions she had foolishly harbored about her seemingly perfect marriage dissolved completely into the cold, harsh light of the illuminated banquet room. She finally saw Preston for exactly what he truly was. He was a hollow, incredibly pathetic coward who had eagerly tried to actively trade her very existence for a massive casino payout to comfortably save his own miserable life. She wrapped her bare arms securely around her own torso, stepping slowly and deliberately away from the dining table, physically distancing her trembling body from the repulsive monster she had unknowingly married. The three plainclothes federal agents stood up simultaneously. They drew their weapons in one seamless motion. Agent Mitchell stepped forward. "Put the knife down, Mr. Caldwell. Dinner is over." The heavy high-carbon steel carving knife slipped entirely from his violently trembling fingers. It plummeted downward, hitting the polished hardwood floor with a loud, sharp metallic clatter that echoed relentlessly against the high coffered ceilings. That single piercing sound finally broke the paralyzing, suffocating spell that had forcefully seized the entire dining room. Preston's legs immediately lost all structural integrity. His knees buckled completely beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto the imported marble tiles, his expensive tailored suit pooling awkwardly and pitifully around his shaking frame. He raised both of his hands high into the air, his palms facing outward toward the armed men in a frantic, desperate gesture of total, unadulterated surrender. His chest heaved up and down with violent, ragged breaths as he stared up at the imposing ring of federal agents slowly surrounding his ruined mahogany dining table. He began to babble uncontrollably. The words spilled rapidly from his mouth in a pathetic, completely incoherent stream of pure cowardice. He begged loudly for mercy, his voice cracking and whining miserably as he desperately tried to explain that he had been mercilessly forced into the massive criminal enterprise. He aggressively claimed that he was merely an innocent victim of circumstance manipulated by dangerous men who threatened his family. He looked frantically toward Valerie, crying openly and pleading for her to immediately intervene. He begged her to tell the agents that he was fundamentally a good man, a loving husband, who had simply made a terrible, tragic mistake under immense external pressure. Valerie turned her tear-streaked face completely away from him. She wrapped her bare arms much tighter around her own trembling torso, utterly disgusted and deeply horrified by the pathetic, whimpering coward currently kneeling on her dining room floor. She absolutely refused to offer him a single shred of comfort, validation, or forgiveness. Agent Mitchell did not hesitate for a single second. He holstered his service weapon smoothly and stepped directly into the bright, unforgiving light of the formal dining room. He pulled a pair of heavy tactical steel handcuffs from his dark leather belt, the cold metal catching the brilliant light from the overhead crystal chandelier. He closed the remaining distance rapidly. He grabbed Preston fiercely by the shoulder, hauling him roughly and forcefully to his feet before aggressively spinning him around. Mitchell slammed him face first against the solid, unyielding surface of the mahogany table directly next to the ruined beef Wellington. Preston cried out sharply in sudden shock and physical pain, but Mitchell completely ignored his frantic, continuous protests. The sharp, heavy mechanical click of the locking steel cuffs echoed sharply through the large room as Mitchell secured Preston's wrists tightly and immovably behind his back. Mitchell leaned in extremely close, pressing his weight against the struggling man. His voice was completely devoid of any trace of human sympathy, delivering the crushing final blow to Preston's entirely shattered reality. He informed Preston that he was officially under federal arrest. He began reading him his constitutional rights with a highly practiced lethal efficiency. He listed the severe federal charges one by one, ensuring each devastating word sank deeply into Preston's highly panicked, racing mind. He stated clearly that Preston was formally being charged with massive wire fraud, systematic international money laundering, extensive corporate document forgery, and most severely, a highly calculated conspiracy to commit murder for extreme financial gain. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the impending federal indictment seemed to finally crush whatever tiny shred of mental resistance Preston had left. He sagged heavily against the smooth wooden table, weeping openly and uncontrollably like a thoroughly frightened child. While Mitchell physically secured the sobbing prisoner, Victor Rossi walked slowly and confidently into the dining room. My brilliant corporate attorney moved with the calm, predatory grace of a highly intelligent man who had flawlessly executed a massive, complex legal strategy. He held a thick, dark, leather-bound folder securely in his right hand. He stopped directly next to where Preston was currently pinned against the long mahogany table. Victor looked down at the weeping man with a chilling, penetrating expression of absolute professional disdain. He slowly opened the leather folder and extracted a thick stack of freshly executed legal documents. The crisp pages were heavily stamped with official county seals, watermarks, and notarized signatures. Victor dropped the heavy stack directly in front of Preston's tear-soaked face, letting the important papers fan out widely across the polished wood. Victor adjusted his impeccably tailored suit jacket and calmly delivered the final, devastating legal reality check. He informed Preston that he owned absolutely nothing. He clearly explained that the entire estate, the luxury vehicles, and every single associated bank account had been meticulously sheltered inside a highly secure, revocable trust from the very beginning of the marriage. He explained that this meticulous legal framework had been designed explicitly to prevent predators from exploiting the family assets. He made it perfectly clear that the fraudulent home equity loan was completely invalid because Preston never possessed the actual authority to pledge the property as collateral in the first place. Victor revealed that I had officially activated the emergency reversion clause at exactly 11:30 this morning, completely and permanently nullifying Preston's false claims to the sprawling property. He stated with absolute, unwavering clarity that Preston was no longer a legal resident of this home. The house had fully reverted to Mr. Caldwell. Victor coldly pronounced that Preston was now merely a hostile, unwanted trespasser illegally occupying private property. Preston sobbed violently into the dark wood of the table, his arrogant spirit entirely broken, his fraudulent life completely dismantled. I sat quietly in my tall leather chair at the opposite end of the room, feeling a profound, deeply satisfying sense of closure finally wash over my tired, calculating mind. I looked across the space at Valerie, giving her a very small, highly reassuring nod. I silently promised her that she and her young son were safe from the dangerous, greedy monster who had tried to destroy them. The 3 armed plainclothes agents stepped forward simultaneously. They grabbed Preston tightly by his upper arms and pulled him firmly away from the ruined dining table. They began to forcefully march him toward the main front hallway, fully preparing to physically transport him into a secure, isolated federal holding facility. I took a very deep, highly steadying breath, preparing to finally stand up across the long room and lovingly comfort my deeply traumatized, shaking daughter. The silence of the house had begun to return. But before I could even push my heavy leather chair back from the table, the incredibly loud, totally deafening sound of violently screeching tires tore abruptly through the quiet, peaceful evening air outside. The harsh noise of heavy rubber furiously burning against the asphalt of my private driveway was immediately followed by the explosive, shattering crash of breaking safety glass and twisting metal from the main front gate. The heavy wrought iron security perimeter had just been forcefully breached. The lethal Eastern European syndicate had finally arrived to violently collect their massive financial debt, completely unaware that they were blindly walking directly into a heavily fortified federal trap. The deafening crash at the front gate sent a violent shockwave through the entire estate. The heavy wrought iron perimeter designed to keep the world out collapsed instantly beneath the brutal force of an armored vehicle. The Eastern European gambling syndicate had arrived to violently collect their massive financial debt, completely unaware they were charging blindly into an overwhelming federal trap. Within mere seconds, the dark front lawn erupted into a chaotic symphony of shouting voices, blinding tactical spotlights, and the sharp, unmistakable metallic clatter of heavy automatic weapons being drawn. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had heavily fortified the exterior grounds hours ago. The tactical strike teams moved with flawless, lethal precision, aggressively intercepting the armed enforcers before they could even reach the grand marble steps of the main entrance. I remained perfectly still in my tall leather chair at the head of the dining table, listening to the muffled commands and the heavy thuds of the violent men being swiftly driven directly into the manicured grass. The entire criminal operation was dismantled in less than 3 minutes. Inside the formal dining room, the atmosphere was entirely devoid of any remaining oxygen. Agent Mitchell hauled Preston roughly to his feet, ignoring the pathetic whimpering cries tearing from the broken man's throat. Preston did not fight back. He possessed absolutely no structural integrity left to resist the crushing weight of his catastrophic failure. He was completely limp, a hollow weeping shell of a man who had gambled his entire existence and lost absolutely everything. The heavy steel handcuffs clinked sharply as the agents dragged him forcefully away from the polished mahogany table. He stumbled awkwardly over the ruined beef Wellington scattered across the floor, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping against the marble tiles. He babbled incoherently, his voice dropping into a pathetic, high-pitched whine as he begged for a single shred of mercy that simply did not exist. The agents marched him out of the room, his pathetic sobbing fading down the long hallway until the heavy front door slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate permanently. I turned my calm, calculating gaze away from the empty doorway and looked down at the floor. Valerie remained pressed tightly against the dark wooden wainscoting, her elegant blue evening dress wrinkled and completely ruined. She had dropped heavily onto her knees, burying her face deeply into her trembling hands. She was sobbing hysterically, her slender shoulders shaking violently with the massive, agonizing realization of her absolute foolishness. She wept for the beautiful, romantic illusions she had blindly worshipped. She wept for the horrific, terrifying monster she had unknowingly invited into her home and her bed. But most of all, she wept for the devastating realization that she had eagerly supported a plan to lock her own father away in a secure dementia ward, entirely convinced by the smooth, calculated lies of a ruthless predator. She had almost discarded the only man who was actively sacrificing everything to protect her and her innocent child from a brutal, violent slaughter. I stood up slowly from my leather chair. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored shirt, maintaining the cold, analytical demeanor I had worn throughout the entire grueling interrogation. I walked carefully around the shattered crystal glass and the scattered silver cutlery, stopping just a few feet away from my deeply traumatized daughter. She looked up at me, her face pale, her mascara running darkly down her cheeks in thick, messy streaks. Her eyes were wide, filled with a desperate, crushing need for comfort. She extended a trembling hand toward me, silently begging for the warm, forgiving embrace of the loving father she had always known. She desperately wanted me to wrap my arms around her shaking body, to stroke her hair, and to softly promise her that everything was going to be perfectly fine. I did not reach out to take her hand. I did not bend down to hold her. An engineer knows that you cannot build a sturdy, reliable structure on a foundation of comforting lies and willful ignorance. I simply stood above her, looking down with a stern, unyielding expression of absolute reality. The time for soft, enabling protection had officially ended. "I love you, Valerie," I said, my voice completely steady and entirely devoid of any soft, comforting warmth. "You are my daughter, and I will always love you. But I will no longer fund your blindness. I will no longer finance your willful refusal to see the harsh, ugly reality of the world around you. You allowed a monster into this home because you were too utterly lazy to look past his expensive suits and his hollow, empty promises. You almost cost my grandson his life tonight." Valerie flinched violently, as if I had struck her across the face. She let out a soft, agonizing cry, lowering her head in deep, unbearable shame. "Tomorrow morning you are going to get a job." I continued delivering the strict, unyielding instructions with cold precision. "You are going to finally learn how to support yourself in the real world. You will completely abandon this pathetic, superficial lifestyle. I will take full legal custody of Leo immediately to ensure he is absolutely safe and securely protected from the massive fallout of this disaster. This entire house will be sold by the end of the month. Every single dollar of the remaining funds will go directly into a strictly locked trust fund designed exclusively for my grandson. You will not have access to a single penny of it." She nodded slowly, her tears splashing heavily onto the marble floor. She did not argue. She did not offer a single word of protest or complaint. The harsh, freezing water of absolute reality had finally washed away her dangerous, childish entitlement. She understood that the comfortable, oblivious chapter of her life was permanently closed. She would have to rebuild her own existence from the ground up, carrying the heavy, painful weight of her monumental mistakes. I turned away from my weeping daughter and walked slowly down the long, quiet hallway toward the main foyer. The massive front door stood wide open, letting the cool, refreshing evening breeze sweep through the stuffy, suffocating mansion. I stopped at the threshold, stepping out onto the grand stone portico. The dark night was brilliantly illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of the federal tactical vehicles blockading the driveway. Heavily armed agents were systematically loading the restrained, defeated syndicate enforcers into the back of secure transport vans. I stood quietly on the steps, my hands resting comfortably in my pockets, and watched the chaotic scene completely unfold before my tired eyes. The structural integrity of my family had completely failed. It had been thoroughly compromised by endless greed, vicious betrayal, and an entirely willful blindness that almost destroyed an innocent child. So I had deliberately and methodically demolished the entire rotting structure. I had forcefully torn it down to the absolute solid bedrock beneath the mud. It was a painful, devastatingly brutal process, but it was the only viable way to pour a strong, reliable new foundation for the future. The hard truth was finally built. Respect is not a limitless resource, and neither is the patience of a father. We spend our lives building a strong foundation of security for our children, hoping they will honor that sacrifice. But when blind entitlement breeds ultimate betrayal, when the hands we held try to violently push us into the dark shadows, we must remember our own strength. True love is not allowing yourself to be victimized. It is having the sheer courage to tear down a completely rotten structure so that the innocent grandchild can stand on solid ground. Sometimes profound protection means letting the guilty fall. That slap woke the engineer in me to demolish his lies. If you believe in facing betrayal with cold, hard justice, hit the like button. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? And what would you have done in my place? Subscribe for more today. Respect.